"Mom, it's just not working. Mark and I have decided it's best if you find your own place. You've become, well, an extra mouth to feed." The words hung in the air of my daughter's pristine, gray and white kitchen, more sterile and chilling than the polished marble countertops. Clara didn't even look at me when she said them. Her focus was entirely on arranging a bouquet of ridiculously expensive tulips in a minimalist vase, snipping the stems with a sharp, final sound that echoed the severing of our relationship. An extra mouth to feed. After 72 years on this earth, after raising her, clothing her, and pouring every ounce of my love and resources into her, I had been reduced to a line item in her household budget. An expense to be cut. My name is Alina Vance, and up until that moment I thought I had a daughter. I had lost my husband, David, 8 months prior. He was a carpenter, a man whose hands were calloused and strong, yet gentle enough to fix my reading glasses with a tiny screwdriver or cradle a newborn Clara as if she were made of spun glass. His battle with cancer had been long and draining, not just emotionally, but financially. We had insurance, of course, but it never covers everything. The experimental treatments, the copays, the things you'll pay any amount of money for just to get one more good day, had methodically drained the savings account we had so carefully built over 50 years of shared life. When David passed, selling our family home was the only logical option. It was a beautiful house, a place David had largely built himself, with a sprawling garden I had tended for decades. But it was too big for one person, and the property taxes were more than my small widow's pension could handle. Clara and her husband, Mark, had been so supportive at first. "Of course you'll come live with us, Mom," Clara had said, her arm around my shoulder, her voice thick with what I mistook for sincere compassion. "We have that lovely guest suite downstairs. You won't be a burden at all. We're family." A burden? The word had slipped out then, too, but I had ignored it, convincing myself it was just a poor choice of words in a difficult time. So I sold the house, the repository of my life's happiest memories, and handed a significant portion of the proceeds to Clara and Mark. "To help with expenses," ID said, "for renovations to make the suite more comfortable for me." They took the check with wide smiles, assuring me it was too generous, but depositing it the very next day. The renovations never happened. The guest suite remained a guest suite, a small, impersonal room in the basement of their large, modern house. My life with them had quickly devolved into a quiet humiliation. I tried to make myself useful, to earn my keep. I did the laundry, cooked dinners they rarely ate, and tended to their small, manicured garden, which felt like a sad parody of my own glorious explosion of flowers and vegetables. But nothing was ever quite right. The laundry wasn't folded to Mark's exacting standards. My cooking was too old-fashioned for their palate. The garden, Clara explained with a patient sigh, was supposed to be low maintenance. They began to control my finances in subtle ways. Mark, an accountant who radiated a smug sense of superiority, offered to help me manage my pension. He set up a joint account, and soon my small income was swallowed by the larger machine of their household. If I needed to buy toiletries or a new pair of shoes, I had to ask, submitting to an informal audit of my needs. "Are you sure you need the name brand aspirin, Alina?" Mark would ask, peering over his laptop. "The generic is half the price." I became a ghost in their home, tiptoeing around their lives. I'd eat my meals alone in the kitchen before they came home, just to avoid the strained silence or their passive-aggressive comments about the rising cost of groceries. I overheard snippets of conversations not meant for my ears. "I had to transfer another $500 from the main account to cover the utilities," Mark would say. "Her presence isn't cheap." Her presence, not Mom, not Alina. I was an abstract financial drain. David had seen it. In his final months, when he was lucid, he would watch the way Mark looked at me, the way Clara's patience wore thin. "Be careful, Ellie," he had whispered to me one night, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't let them take your independence. You're stronger than you think." He had given me a small, heavy key, one I didn't recognize. "This is for the old toolbox in the storage unit. My real retirement plan. Don't open it unless you have to. But when you do, promise me you'll listen to what's inside." I had dismissed it as the rambling of a sick man. a toolbox. His retirement plan was the pension and our savings, most of which were now gone. I put the key in my jewelry box and forgot about it, lost in the fog of my grief and the stress of my new living situation. And now this, the final, brutal dismissal. An extra mouth to feed. I stood there, my hands gripping the back of a kitchen chair, the wood cool and unyielding against my skin. I looked at my daughter's back, at the expensive silk blouse she was wearing, a blouse I probably paid for with my pension. I saw the sleek lines of her perfect kitchen, a kitchen I had cleaned just that morning. And for the first time in months, the heavy fog of grief began to lift, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. David was gone. My home was gone. And now my daughter was telling me that I was no longer welcome. I had nothing left to lose. "All right, Clara," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "When would you like me to leave?" She finally turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. I think she had expected tears, pleading. She had not expected calm acceptance. It threw her off her rhythm. "Well, Mom, we don't want to be harsh, but the sooner the better. We have a friend of Mark's who is looking to rent the suite. The extra income would really help us right now. Maybe a week." 1 week. 7 days to pack the few belongings I had left and disappear from her life. 1 week to find a place to live on a pension that I no longer controlled. "I see," I said. I didn't say anything else. I didn't rail or weep. I simply turned and walked down the stairs to my basement room, the impersonal space that had been my cage for the better part of a year. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm that was beginning to rage inside me. She thought she was discarding me. She thought she was cutting a financial burden from her life. She and her smug, calculating husband believed they had won, that they had taken everything from me. But as I sat there, I remembered David's raspy voice. I remembered his calloused hand pressing a small, heavy key into my palm. I remembered his words, my real retirement plan. A flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a grim, burning curiosity began to glow in the darkness of my despair. I went to my jewelry box and took out the key. It felt heavy in my hand, a solid piece of metal in a world that had become flimsy and uncertain. A toolbox. It seemed absurd. David was a carpenter, not a wizard. What could possibly be in a toolbox that could help me now? But it was all I had. The next morning, I called a taxi to take me to the storage facility. I didn't tell Clara or Mark where I was going. I had packed a small bag, just in case. The air in the facility was stale and cool, smelling of dust and forgotten memories. I found our unit, number 247, and the lock clicked open easily. The storage unit was filled with the remnants of our life together. Furniture we couldn't fit into Clara's house, boxes of old photographs, David's collection of woodworking magazines. And in the very back, behind a stack of chairs, was the toolbox. It wasn't a normal toolbox. It was a large, heavy-duty chest, the kind master craftsmen use, made of solid oak with brass fittings. It was old and beautiful, a piece of furniture in its own right. David had built it himself, of course. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn wood, feeling the ghost of his touch. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. I half expected to see a collection of antique tools, maybe some valuable first editions he had collected. What I saw instead took my breath away. There were no tools. The chest was lined with green felt, and nestled within carefully constructed compartments were not hammers and saws, but neat stacks of documents held together with binder clips. There were stock certificates, thick bundles of them, for companies I had only vaguely heard of. Tech startups, pharmaceutical firms, blue-chip corporations. There were deed documents, not for houses, but for commercial properties, a small shopping plaza, an office building downtown. And there were several bound ledgers, their pages filled with David's precise, neat handwriting. At the very top was a thick manila envelope with my name, Eliner, written on the front. With shaking fingers, I opened it and pulled out a letter. "My dearest Ellie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're in the kind of trouble I always feared. Forgive me for the secrecy, my love. I never wanted to burden you with the details of business, and frankly, I never fully trusted what would happen if Clara and that husband of hers knew the truth of our finances. I always saw the greed in that boy's eyes. My eyes filled with tears, blurring the words. David had seen it all. He had known. You know me, Ellie, I was a simple carpenter. But while I worked with my hands during the day, I spent my nights learning. I studied the stock market. I read books on real estate. Every extra dollar we ever saved, every little bonus I got, I didn't put it in a simple savings account. I invested it. I started small with a few shares here and there. Some of them failed, but many of them, Ellie, many of them grew. The world sees a carpenter, and they don't expect him to understand compound interest or investment trusts. I used that. It was my advantage. No one ever saw me coming. I looked back into the chest. It wasn't just a few investments. It was a fortune. The ledgers detailed every transaction, every purchase, every dividend. The numbers were staggering, with so many zeros that my mind struggled to comprehend them. He had been quietly building an empire while I thought we were just a comfortable, middle-class family. The letter continued, "Everything in this chest is yours. It's all held within a private trust, the David Vance Trust, of which you are the sole beneficiary and now the sole trustee. The man who helped me set it all up is named Arthur Gable. He's an old-school financial advisor, a man of integrity. His card is clipped to this letter. Call him. He's been expecting this day, and he will know what to do. He will help you take control. This is your independence, Ellie. This is your strength. Don't let anyone ever make you feel like a burden again. You are the rock on which our family was built. Now, show them the mountain that rock came from. With all my love, forever, David." I sat there on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit for what felt like hours, surrounded by the ghosts of my past and the incredible, shocking reality of my future. I cried. I cried for David, for the incredible gift he had left me, for his foresight, for his quiet, fierce love. I cried for the daughter I had lost, the one who had so casually discarded me. But as the tears subsided, something else began to rise in their place. It was a cold, hard anger. A righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of my grief-stricken helplessness. An extra mouth to feed. My daughter and her husband had kicked me out of their house because they saw me as a financial drain. They lived in a luxury apartment building, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations, all while making their own mother feel like a beggar for asking for a few dollars for aspirin. I looked at the documents again, specifically at the real estate portfolio. My eyes scanned the list of commercial properties, and then I saw it, an address that was chillingly familiar. 121 Sterling Avenue. It was the address of the high-rise apartment building where Clara and Mark lived. According to the deed in my hands, held by a subsidiary of my trust, I didn't just own a piece of it. I owned the entire building. I took a deep, shuddering breath and a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed a sword after being told she was going to a slaughter. Clara and Mark thought they had kicked me to the curb. They had no idea that I owned the street, the curb, and the building they slept in every night. The game had just changed, and I was about to write a whole new set of rules. I closed the oak chest, the click of the lock echoing in the silence. I found Mr. Gable's business card, a simple, elegant piece of cardstock with a name and a number. I walked out of the storage facility and into the bright sunlight, which no longer felt harsh but invigorating. I didn't call a taxi. I walked. I walked for miles, my mind racing, David's words echoing in my head. Show them the mountain that rock came from. Oh, I would. I was going to show them the entire mountain range. My first step was finding a place to live. I wasn't going to crawl back to Clara's house for the remaining few days of her cruel deadline. My pride wouldn't allow it. Using my phone, I found a small, extended-stay hotel, clean and respectable, and checked in for 2 weeks. It felt liberating to pay with my own debit card, to not have to ask for permission. The room was small, but it was mine. That first night, I laid all the documents out on the bed and began to truly read, to understand the scope of what David had built. He had been a genius, a quiet, unassuming genius. He had diversified his portfolio, balancing high-risk, high-reward tech stocks with stable, income-generating real estate. The dividends alone provided a yearly income that was more than I had ever dreamed of. The next morning, I dressed with care. I chose a simple but elegant navy blue dress, one David had always loved. I did my hair, put on a touch of lipstick, and looked at the woman in the mirror. She looked different. The defeated, hunched-over widow was gone. In her place stood a woman with a purpose, her eyes holding a new, steely glint. At exactly 9 o'clock, I called the number on the business card. A warm, professional voice answered on the second ring. Gable Financial, Arthur Gable speaking. Mr. Gable, I began, my voice clear and firm. My name is Alina Vance. I believe you were expecting my call. There was a short pause on the other end, and then the warmth in his voice deepened. Mrs. Vance, yes, I have been expecting your call for some time now. I was so very sorry to hear about David's passing. He was a great man. One of the shrewdest and most honorable clients I have ever had the privilege of serving. He spoke very highly of you, Mr. Gable, I said. Please call me Arthur. And I hope you will allow me to say this, Alina, but David was worried this day might come. He wanted to ensure you were protected. Are you in a safe place? The simple question, the genuine concern in his voice, almost broke the dam of my composure. It had been so long since anyone had asked if I was safe. Yes, Arthur, I am, but I need to meet with you as soon as possible. There are developments. I need to understand everything in this portfolio, and I need to take control of the trust immediately. Of course, he said, his tone shifting to one of crisp efficiency. My schedule is cleared. Can you be at my office at 11 o'clock? His office was in one of the older, more prestigious buildings downtown, the kind with a marble lobby and quiet, wood-paneled elevators. Arthur Gable was a man in his late 60s, with a kind face, a sharp suit, and eyes that saw everything. He greeted me not with pity, but with profound respect. He ushered me into a comfortable office lined with books, and for the next 3 hours, he walked me through every single document David had left me. He explained the structure of the trust, how it was set up to protect the assets from probate and taxes, and to provide me with absolute control. He broke down the stock portfolio, explaining the logic behind David's choices. But my focus, my intense, burning focus, was on the real estate. The Sterling Avenue building, I said, my voice low. My daughter and her husband live there. They are in apartment 15B. Arthur's kind face hardened slightly. Yes, David mentioned that. It's one of the trust's most valuable assets. A beautiful building, but if you'll permit me to be blunt, it has been underperforming for years. Underperforming? What do you mean? David acquired it a decade ago. At the time, he insisted on keeping the existing property management company in place to avoid raising any flags. He wanted to remain anonymous. Unfortunately, they've grown complacent. The rents are well below the current market rate for that neighborhood, nearly a third of what they should be. We've been advising the trust to replace the management and adjust the rates for years, but David was hesitant. He didn't want to affect his own daughter's living expenses. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. My dear, sweet David had been subsidizing his daughter's lavish lifestyle for a decade without her ever knowing, all because he didn't want to burden her. And that same daughter had just thrown me out for being an extra mouth to feed. Arthur, I said, looking him directly in the eye, David's policy of non-intervention is over. I am the trustee now, and I want to make some changes. First, I want to find the best, most aggressive property management company in the city. Second, I want a full audit of all the building's finances. And third, I want to bring all the units up to the current market rent as soon as their leases allow. Arthur Gable leaned back in his chair, a slow, approving smile spreading across his face. Alina, it will be my absolute pleasure to facilitate that. The board of the subsidiary that holds the property will need to vote on it, but as the representative of the majority shareholder, the trust, my vote is the only one that truly matters. Consider it done. There's one more thing, I said, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I need a place to live, a proper home. The The penthouse apartment at 121 Sterling Avenue, is it occupied? Arthur consulted his files. No, it's been kept vacant for years. David always intended it for you should you ever need it. He said it had the best view in the city. Of course he did, my wonderful, thoughtful David. Then please, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, begin the paperwork. I'd like to move in as soon as possible. For the next week, my life was a whirlwind of activity. I met with lawyers, accountants, and Arthur, signing documents that transferred full, active control of the vast Vance trust into my hands. I was no longer a displaced widow living in a hotel. I was a businesswoman, the head of a financial empire I was only just beginning to understand. I also began my new life as the anonymous owner of 121 Sterling Avenue. Arthur hired a new property management firm, a slick, efficient company named Urban Edge Properties. They were known for their aggressive tactics in maximizing profits, and I gave them a very clear mandate: audit everything, streamline operations, and prepare the notices for the rent adjustments. The current leases would be honored, but any unit with an expiring lease was to be renewed at the full market rate. I asked for the file on apartment 15B. Clara and Mark's lease was up for renewal in 6 weeks. Perfect. While the corporate wheels were turning, I prepared to move into the penthouse. It was a sprawling, beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. It had been kept clean but was completely unfurnished. It was a blank canvas, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a spark of excitement. I hired an interior decorator, a young, vibrant woman who was thrilled with the budget I gave her. I wanted the space to be warm, elegant, and comfortable, everything my daughter's cold, minimalist house was not. I wanted it to be a home. During this time, I received a single text message from Clara. "Mom, are you okay? I haven't heard from you. I hope you've found a place." The casual cruelty of it, the feigned concern, was staggering. She hadn't called, she hadn't asked if I needed help or money. She had just sent a cursory text to assuage whatever tiny flicker of guilt she might have felt. I typed back a simple reply: "I'm fine. I've found a place and am getting settled. Thank you for your concern." I made sure the tone was placid, giving nothing away. Let her think I was living in some tiny, sad apartment for seniors. Let her and Mark enjoy their last few weeks of blissful ignorance. While the penthouse was being furnished, I found a new routine. I spent my mornings with Arthur, learning the intricacies of my portfolio. He was a patient teacher, and I was a surprisingly avid student. I discovered I had a knack for it, a good head for numbers, and a common-sense approach that David had also possessed. The fear of the unknown was replaced by the thrill of competence. In the afternoons, I would walk through the city, exploring neighborhoods, visiting museums, and simply enjoying my newfound freedom. One afternoon, I decided to visit my new building, but not as the owner. I dressed down, wearing a simple coat and a headscarf, and entered through the lobby. It was just as I remembered from the few times I had visited Clara, opulent, with a doorman who eyed me with slight suspicion. I simply said I was visiting a friend and took the elevator up, but not to the penthouse. I got off a few floors below and found the stairwell. I wanted to see the building from the inside, to understand the asset I now controlled. As I was walking down one of the quiet, carpeted hallways, a door opened and a woman my age struggled to exit, carrying a small bag of trash and leaning heavily on a walker. She dropped the bag, and its contents spilled across the carpet. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered in frustration. I rushed to help her. "Here, let me get that for you." I quickly gathered the trash and helped her tie the bag shut. She looked at me with weary but grateful eyes. "Thank you so, dear. My hands aren't what they used to be." "It's no trouble at all," I said. "I'm a leaner." "Sadie," she replied. "I live in 12C, lived here for 20 years, though I don't know for how much longer." "Why is that?" I asked, my interest piqued. "Oh, you know," she sighed, leaning against the wall. "New owners, they say." The management sent a letter. Whispers are the rents are going to go through the roof. A place like this, it's not for retired school teachers anymore. It's for young people with money, like that couple in 15B. Always see them coming and going in their fancy car. They don't have time to say hello to an old woman like me. My blood ran cold. The couple in 15B, she was talking about my daughter. I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. That must be very worrying for you. Worrying is the half of it, Sadie said, her voice trembling slightly. This is my home. My husband, Frank, passed away in that apartment. All my memories are here. To have to leave now, I don't know where I'd go. Her words struck a chord deep inside me. Her story was my story, but without the miraculous toolbox. She was the woman I would have been if not for David's incredible foresight. She was a real person, a kind woman named Sadie, who was about to be displaced by my order, my need for what? Revenge, justice. I looked at her worried face, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced my cold resolve. What was I doing? Was I becoming just as heartless as them? I was so focused on Clara and Mark that I hadn't even considered the other tenants, the other lives that would be upended by a massive rent increase. People like Sadie. I helped Sadie back to her apartment, promising to check on her again. As I left the building, my mind was in turmoil. David had wanted me to be strong, to claim my independence. But he had also been a deeply compassionate man. He had kept the rents low for a reason. He would never have wanted me to hurt innocent people just to get back at our daughter. I called Arthur as soon as I got back to my hotel. Arthur, we have a problem. I told him about Sadie, about the other long-term residents who were likely on fixed incomes. I can't just throw them all out on the street. It's not right. Arthur was silent for a moment. This is a complication, Alina. The new management company is already moving forward. The notices are scheduled to be sent out at the end of the week. Then we have to stop them, I said. Or at least amend the plan. There has to be a way to achieve my objective regarding 15B without devastating the lives of everyone else in the building. There might be, Arthur said slowly, the wheels in his clever mind clearly turning. We could create a tiered system. New tenants and renewals for corporate leased apartments are charged the full market rate. But for existing, long-term residents over a certain age, we could implement a grandfather clause. A much smaller, more manageable increase. It would cut into the building's overall profitability, but it would be the more ethical approach. Do it, I said without hesitation. Draft the proposal immediately. I want Sadie and the other long-term residents protected. But Arthur, the renewal for apartment 15B must be at the full, unadjusted, triple market rate. No exceptions. Understood, Alina, he replied. Consider it handled. Hanging up the phone, I felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about building something new. It was about wielding the power David had given me not just with strength, but with wisdom and compassion. I would punish the guilty, yes, but I would also protect the innocent. That was a legacy David would have been proud of. A few days later, my new apartment was ready. The moving trucks arrived with beautiful new furniture. The decorators put the finishing touches on everything, and I spent my first night in the penthouse of the building where my daughter lived, 15 floors below me. Looking out at the glittering city lights from my window, I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm inside me had calmed. I was no longer just reacting to the hurt Clara had caused me. I was acting with purpose. I had a plan. I had a home. And I was ready for the next phase to begin. I knew that soon, a crisp white envelope from Urban Edge Properties would be landing at the door of apartment 15B, and the comfortable little world of Clara and Mark was about to come crashing down. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered by a courier, not the regular mailman, which was the first sign that something was amiss. The envelope was crisp and expensive, bearing the logo of Urban Edge Properties. Mark brought it in, tossing it onto the granite kitchen island with the rest of the mail. He was in a foul mood. A deal he had been counting on at work had fallen through. More junk, he grumbled, loosening his tie and heading for the fridge to grab a craft beer. Clara picked it up, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the embossed logo. This looks important, Mark. It's not junk mail. She slid it open with a silver letter opener, her movements precise and elegant. She unfolded the single sheet of heavy bond paper and began to read. I, of course, was not there to see it, but I could imagine the scene with perfect clarity. I knew my daughter. I knew her husband. I had spent 8 agonizing months studying their habits, their expressions, their vanities. So, as I sat in my plush armchair 15 floors above them, sipping a cup of chamomile tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, I allowed the scene to play out in my mind's eye. I saw Clara's perfectly composed face begin to crumble. The placid expression would tighten first around her mouth. Her eyes, which were usually scanning for imperfections in her surroundings, would narrow, rereading the words, certain they were a mistake. "Mark," she would say, her voice a little too sharp, losing its practiced, airy quality. "You need to see this." Mark, irritated at being disturbed from his self-pity, would amble over. He'd take the letter from her, his eyes scanning it quickly, impatiently. Then he would stop. He would read it again, slower this time, his lips moving silently. The color would drain from his face, leaving his normally smug expression looking slack and foolish. The letter itself was a masterpiece of cold, corporate legalese, a document I had personally reviewed with Arthur and the management company. It was a formal notice of lease renewal terms for apartment 15B, 121 Sterling Avenue. It politely informed Mr. and Mrs. Mark Stanton that their current lease would expire in 6 weeks, and they were being offered the opportunity to renew for a term of 1 year. It then detailed the new monthly rental rate, a number that was precisely 3 times what they were currently paying. It was a figure so outrageously high, so far beyond their means, that it could only be interpreted as a polite, but firm, eviction notice. "This is a joke," Mark would finally sputter, the letter trembling in his hand. "A typo. It has to be a typo. They can't do this. It's illegal." "Is it?" Clara's voice would be rising, bordering on hysteria. "They're giving us notice. They're offering a renewal." "But that number, Mark, that number. We can't possibly afford that. That's more than your monthly take-home pay." "Of course we can't afford it." He would snap, his anger a shield for his panic. "Nobody can afford that. It's extortion. Who are these people? Urban Edge Properties. I've never heard of them. The building was sold, I knew it. These new owners are some kind of vulture capitalists." In my penthouse, I took a serene sip of my tea, vulture capitalist. I suppose, from his perspective, that was accurate. The next morning, I knew exactly what Mark would do. As an accountant, his world revolved around rules and numbers. He would believe this was a problem that could be solved by being aggressive and quoting regulations. He would call Urban Edge Properties, demand to speak to a manager, and attempt to bully them into submission. I had already discussed this eventuality with the management company's president, a sharp woman named Ms. Jennings. She had assured me that her staff was more than prepared. The call, as it was later recounted to me in a summary report, went exactly as I'd predicted. Mark was belligerent from the start. He demanded to know the legal justification for such an exorbitant and predatory increase. The representative on the phone, a calm and well-trained young man, politely informed him that under city tenancy laws, there were no rent control restrictions on luxury buildings like 121 Sterling, and as long as proper notice was given, the owner was free to set the renewal rate at the current market value. Market value. Mark had apparently shouted into the phone, his voice echoing in his open-plan living room. "That is not the market value. It's insanity." "I assure you, sir," the representative replied coolly, "our analysts have done a thorough assessment of comparable properties in the neighborhood. The rate is accurate. We understand it is a significant adjustment." "Adjustment? It's a death sentence. We're being forced out of our home." "You are being offered a renewal, sir. You are free to accept it or decline it. If you choose to decline, your lease will terminate on the specified date, and you will be required to vacate the premises. The building has a long list of prospective tenants willing to pay the market rate." The conversation ended with Mark slamming the phone down, his face a mask of impotent rage. He had met a wall of polite, unshakable corporate policy, a wall that I had built. Meanwhile, my own life in the building was beginning to take shape. I made a point of visiting Sadie in 12C every other day. I would bring her a pastry from the bakery down the street or just sit and chat with her for an hour. She was a delight, full of stories about her years as a teacher and about the history of the building. "You know, Alina," she said to me one afternoon over tea in her cozy, slightly cluttered apartment, "that letter came for me, too. I was so terrified, I couldn't bring myself to open it for a whole day." "Oh, Sadie, I'm so sorry you went through that," I said, my heart aching with a guilt I couldn't express. "Well, don't be," she said, her eyes twinkling. "When I finally got the courage to open it, I nearly fell off my walker. They did raise the rent, but only by a tiny bit, $50. They called it a long-term resident appreciation rate. Can you imagine, in this day and age, appreciation?" She shook her head in wonder. "These new owners, whoever they are, they must have a heart after all. They're being tough on the new leases, I hear, but they're looking after us old-timers." Frank, God rest his soul, would never have believed it. I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "That's wonderful news, Sadie, truly." Knowing I had eased her fear was a balm to my soul. It affirmed that my plan was not just about retribution, but also about a different kind of justice, a quiet act of compassion that David would have applauded. A week passed. The deadline for Clara and Mark to respond to the renewal offer was drawing closer. I knew they would be scrambling, looking at other apartments, and quickly discovering that even a much smaller, less luxurious place would cost more than they had been paying. Their comfortable life, built on the foundation of my husband's secret generosity, was a bubble that was about to burst. And then, as I knew it would, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Clara's name. I let it ring 4 times before answering, taking a moment to compose myself, to slip back into the role of the frail, slightly confused widow she thought me to be. "Hello." I answered, my voice soft. "Mom, oh, thank God you answered." Her voice was tight with stress, all traces of her usual condescension gone, replaced by a raw, frantic energy. "Clara, dear, what is it? You sound upset." Upset is not the word, Mom. It's a catastrophe. Mark and I are being kicked out of our apartment." I feigned shock, injecting a note of quavering concern into my voice. "Kicked out? Oh my goodness, but why? Did you do something wrong?" "No, we didn't do anything wrong," she cried, her frustration boiling over. "The building was sold, and the new owners are monsters. They're tripling our rent, Mom, tripling it. It's impossible. We can't pay it. They're forcing us out onto the street." "Oh, Clara, that's just terrible," I cooed, feeling a cold satisfaction settle deep in my chest. "Tripling it, that seems illegal." "That's what Mark said, but he's looked into it, and apparently it's not. There's some loophole for luxury buildings. It's a nightmare. We've been looking at other places, and everything is so expensive. We'd have to move to a terrible neighborhood, to a tiny little box. After everything we've worked for." Everything they had worked for. The phrase was so bitterly ironic. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I made a sympathetic sound. "Oh, you poor things, I don't know what to say. Is there anything I can do?" There was a pause. This was it, the moment she would ask, the reason for her call. "Well, Mom," she began, her voice becoming hesitant, almost wheedling. "Mark and I were talking, and you know that money you got from selling the house. You said you still had some of it saved." I held my breath, letting the silence stretch. I made her say the words. "We were just thinking," she continued, stumbling over the sentence, "that maybe you could help us out, just for a little while. A loan, of course, we'd pay you back. But if you could help us with a deposit on a new place, or maybe even help us with the rent for a few months until Mark gets his end-of-year bonus, we just don't have that kind of cash on hand right now." The audacity of it was breathtaking. She had thrown me out of her home, labeling me an extra mouth to feed, and now, not a month later, she was asking me for tens of thousands of dollars to maintain her lifestyle. She still saw me as nothing more than a resource to be tapped, a walking bank account with no feelings or needs of my own. It was time to gently tighten the screw. "Oh, Clara," I said, my voice filled with a carefully crafted sadness. "I wish I could, I truly do, but I'm afraid that money is all gone." "Gone?" Her voice was a shocked squeak. "What do you mean gone, all of it?" "Well, dear, finding a new place to live was more expensive than I thought," I lied smoothly. And I had to pay a very large security deposit and several months' rent in advance, because my income is so low. And I had to buy a few things, some furniture, kitchen supplies. It goes so quickly. I'm afraid I'm living on my pension now, and it's a very tight budget. I'm having to be very, very careful with every penny. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she processed this new information. Her emergency bailout plan had just evaporated. The well was dry. "Oh," she finally said, her voice flat and cold. The desperation was gone, replaced by a familiar chill. I was no longer of use to her. I see. Well, that's unfortunate." "I'm so sorry, dear," I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "I feel terrible that I can't help. You know I would if I could. You'll just have to be strong. I'm sure you and Mark will figure something out. You're both so clever." "Right," she said curtly. "Well, I have to go, Mom. I have a lot to do." "Of course, dear. Call me any time." She hung up without saying goodbye. I placed my phone on the small marble table beside me and looked out the window again. The city was a tapestry of twinkling lights below me. A deep sense of calm washed over me. This was not the end of my plan. It was merely the end of the beginning. I had removed her safety net. I had shown her that the Bank of Mom was closed permanently. Now, she and Mark were truly on their own, facing the consequences of their choices, staring into the financial abyss they had so callously expected me to occupy. And I would be watching, from 15 floors up, as they began to fall. What did you think of the turn the story just took? I wonder what city you are listening from. Please let me know in the comments. If this story is touching your heart, you can show your appreciation by sending a super thanks, which helps Mama Lottie Stories to continue creating content for you. Your support means the world. Now, back to our story, and don't forget, there are more stories waiting for you at the end of this one. The weeks that followed Clara's phone call were a study in escalating panic, a drama I observed from a comfortable distance. I had my sources. Sadie, my dear friend in 12C, was a wonderful, if unintentional, informant. She was part of a small knitting circle that met in the building's communal lounge, a group of long-term residents who had seen everything and missed nothing. "That poor couple in 15B," Sadie remarked one afternoon, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "They seem to be in a real state." The doorman told Beatrice, who told me that they've been having arguments, loud ones. You can hear their voices echoing in the hallway sometimes. "Oh dear," I said, feigning mild concern. "I hope everything is all right with them." "Well, it can't be," Sadie continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "They're moving. They have to be out by the end of the month. Beatrice saw them bringing in boxes. They look exhausted, both of them, and so angry. The wife, Clara, I think her name is, snapped at the concierge yesterday just for wishing her a good morning. So they hadn't found a miracle. They were packing. They were leaving. The knowledge gave me a grim satisfaction. I also made it a point to be in the lobby occasionally, sitting in one of the armchairs and reading a book, a new resident familiarizing herself with her surroundings. From this vantage point, I saw them a few times. They didn't notice me. To them, I was just another anonymous, elderly woman, part of the building's scenery. But I saw them. Clara, who had always been so meticulously put together, looked frayed at the edges. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled, and there were faint, dark circles under her eyes that even her expensive concealer couldn't hide. Mark's confident swagger was gone. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his face set in a permanent scowl. They moved like two people carrying an immense, invisible weight, and in a way, they were. They were carrying the weight of reality, a burden they had tried to outsource to me. I continued to build my own life. With Arthur's guidance, I made my first few forays into philanthropy. I found a local women's shelter, one that helped older women who had fallen into homelessness, and I made a substantial, anonymous donation through the trust. I met with the director, a compassionate, overworked woman named Maria, and listened to her stories. The women she helped were women like me, but without a David, without a secret toolbox. They were widows, divorcees, women who had been cast aside by their families, left with nothing. Their stories broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. I decided to create a new initiative within the trust, a grant program specifically for shelters like Maria's. David had given me a mountain. I would use it to give others a foothold. The day of the move arrived. It was a gray, overcast Saturday. I watched from my panoramic window as the moving truck, a much smaller and shabbier one than the one that had moved their things into the building years ago, pulled up to the service entrance. I saw Clara and Mark directing the movers, their gestures sharp and impatient. There was no warmth between them, just the grim efficiency of two people completing an unpleasant task. Later that day, Sadie called me, her voice buzzing with news. "Eleanor, you will not believe it. The wife, Clara, from 15B, she was in the elevator with me. She was carrying a box of cleaning supplies and she just looked dreadful. And she was talking on her phone, very quietly, but you know my hearing aid is excellent." "Oh," I prompted, settling into my chair. She was talking to her husband, and she said, "I heard it clear as a bell," she said. "I can't believe we're moving into your mother's basement, Mark. My mother couldn't help, and your mother is making us clear out the junk room. This is a complete and utter humiliation." Mark's mother's basement, so that was where they had landed. I felt a surge of something dark and triumphant. My daughter, who had relegated me to her basement guest suite and then thrown me out, was now being forced to move into her own mother-in-law's basement. The poetry of it was not lost on me, but the victory felt strangely hollow. As I pictured Clara in another woman's basement, surrounded by another family's clutter, a pang of something uncomfortable pricked at me. It wasn't pity, not yet, but it was a flicker of the old maternal instinct I had tried so hard to suppress. I quickly pushed it away. She had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. A few days later, Ms. Jennings from Urban Edge Properties called me. "Mrs. Vance, I wanted to inform you that the Stantons have fully vacated apartment 15B. They left the unit in perfect condition, I must say. And they left something for you at the front desk." For me, I was startled. "They know I live here." No, Ms. Jennings clarified. "They left a package for the new owner of the building. The concierge told them he would pass it along. It's a box of some kind. Shall I have it sent up to you?" "Yes, please," I said, my curiosity overwhelming my caution. A short while later, a uniformed doorman brought a small, sealed cardboard box to my door. My name wasn't on it. It was addressed simply to the owner, 121 Sterling Avenue. I took it inside and placed it on my large kitchen island, the same spot where Clara and Mark's fate had been sealed by a letter just a few weeks earlier. My hands trembled slightly as I cut the packing tape. What could it be? A letter of complaint. A desperate appeal. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of me, David, and a 5-year-old Clara taken at the beach. We were all laughing, squinting in the bright sun. David had his arm around me, and Clara was sitting on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair. We looked happy. We were a family. Underneath the photo was a single, folded piece of notepaper. It was from Clara. Her handwriting, usually a flawless, elegant script, was shaky and uneven. "I don't know who you are," the note began. "I don't know why you bought this building only to throw good people out of their homes. We were good tenants. We always paid our rent on time. We never caused any trouble. What you did was cruel and unnecessary. It destroyed our lives." But as I was packing up the last of my things, I found this photo. I remembered a time before money mattered, before apartment buildings and status and everything else got in the way. My father, the man in this picture, was a carpenter. He was a simple, honest man. He would have been disgusted by a person like you, a person who treats people like numbers on a spreadsheet. I am sending you this so you have to look at the faces of the people whose lives you have ruined. Maybe it will give you a moment of pause before you do this to another family. Maybe you have a family of your own. Maybe you have a mother. If you do, I hope she never has to find out what a heartless monster her child grew up to be. I sank onto a stool, the note shaking in my hand. The words were a knife, twisted in a wound I thought had begun to heal. Heartless monster. It was what I had called her in the privacy of my own mind. Now she was hurling the same accusation back at me, blindly, unknowingly. She had completely missed the point. She saw the rent increase as a random act of corporate cruelty, a lightning strike from a faceless entity. It never once occurred to her that it was a consequence, a direct result of her own actions. She still saw herself as a victim, a good person to whom a bad thing had happened. There was no remorse in her letter, no self-reflection, just blame and righteous indignation. And yet, the photograph. Why send the photograph? Was it purely a weapon, a way to shame the anonymous owner? Or was there something more? Was it a cry of pain from a woman who had just realized, in the wreckage of her life, what she had truly lost? Not the apartment, not the status, but that feeling, the feeling in the photograph, the feeling of being loved and safe and part of a family that wasn't measured by its budget. I stood there for a long time, staring at the smiling faces from a lifetime ago. The anger I had nurtured for weeks had cooled, leaving behind a heavy, aching sadness. My plan had worked perfectly. I had stripped them of their home, their comfort, their pride. I had given them a taste of the precariousness they had tried to force upon me. I had won. But looking at that photograph, I felt a profound sense of loss. In winning my independence, I had cemented the destruction of my family. I put the photograph on the mantelpiece in my beautiful, spacious living room. It looked small and out of place amidst the new, expensive decor. It was a ghost, a reminder of a life that was gone forever. The note, however, I kept. I folded it and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. It was a reminder of a different kind. A reminder that my daughter was still out there, lost in a wilderness of her own making, and that she still had no idea who had drawn the map. The story wasn't over. I had broken her. Now, I had to decide if it was my job to put her back together again, or to let her learn to heal herself. The weeks after the move settled into a new, strange rhythm. The photograph on my mantelpiece was a constant, silent presence. Some days I would look at it and feel the sharp sting of betrayal all over again, the memory of Clara's cold voice in her perfect kitchen overriding the happy image from the past. On other days, I would see the 5-year-old girl on her father's shoulders, a child full of innocent joy, and I would feel a profound, aching sorrow for the woman she had become, and for the mother I had lost along the way. Clara's note, tucked away in my nightstand, was a testament to her blindness, her inability to connect her actions to her fate. She saw herself as the victim of a heartless monster, never once considering that the monster might simply be a mirror. My life, in stark contrast to hers, was blossoming. The penthouse, once a symbol of my strategic victory, was slowly becoming a home. I filled it not with the cold, minimalist decor that Clara favored, but with warm colors, comfortable furniture, and books. I bought plants, dozens of them, and created a small indoor garden by the vast windows, a humble echo of the sprawling Eden I had left behind. I found a quiet joy in the simple routines, watching the sunrise with my morning coffee, reading for hours in a comfortable chair, cooking simple meals for myself in my state-of-the-art kitchen. I was not just independent, I was content. My work with the foundation became the true center of my new life. After my initial donation to the women's shelter, I asked Arthur to arrange another meeting with the director, Maria. This time, I didn't want to be an anonymous benefactor. I wanted to be involved. I met her at the shelter, a clean but well-worn building in a less fashionable part of the city. Maria was a woman who radiated competence and exhaustion in equal measure. "Mrs. Vance, your donation, I still don't have the words. You have no idea what a difference it has made. We were about to cut our outreach program. Now we can expand it." "I'm glad to hear it, Maria," I said, looking around the small, tidy office. "But I'm not here to talk about the money. I'm here to offer something else. My time." Maria looked surprised. "Your time? Mrs. Vance, we are always grateful for volunteers, but the work here can be difficult." "I'm stronger than I look," I said, a faint smile on my lips. It was a sentence I had said to myself 1,000 times in the past few months. "I'm not a trained counselor, but I can listen. I can sort donations. I can serve meals. I want to understand the problem, not just write checks to solve it. And so, twice a week, I would take a taxi from my luxury high-rise to the shelter. I wore simple, comfortable clothes, and no one there knew who I was, other than a volunteer named Alina. The staff was kind, the residents were a mix of wary, broken, and resilient women. I mostly worked in the background, sorting clothes in the donation room, helping in the kitchen. But as Maria had predicted, the real work was in the listening. One day, I was sitting with a woman named Brenda. She was in her late 60s, with a face etched with worry lines and hands that were never still. She was telling me about her son. "He's a good boy, really," she said, her voice a low murmur as we folded donated towels. But his wife, she never liked me, said I was always interfering. When my Frank passed, I moved in with them. I thought it would be fine. I helped with the grandkids, I cooked, I cleaned. But she saw me as a burden. An extra mouth, you know. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I stopped folding, my hands frozen on a threadbare blue towel. An extra mouth. The casual, cruel, dismissive term that had shattered my world. Brenda didn't notice my reaction. She was lost in her own painful memory. One day, she just told me it wasn't working out. They were selling the house and downsizing. There wasn't room for me. My son, he just stood there, didn't say a word. He drove me here to this shelter, gave me $200, and told me he'd call me when they got settled. That was 6 months ago. I haven't heard from him since. She finally looked at me, her eyes swimming with a grief that I understood all too well. How does a child do that, Alina? How do you just throw your own mother away? I couldn't answer her. All I could do was put my hand on her arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. I was looking at my own reflection, a ghost of the life I could have had. Brenda's story and the stories of the other women became a part of me. They were a constant reminder that my situation was unique only in its outcome. The initial betrayal, the casual cruelty of being deemed worthless by your own child, was a tragically common story. My anger towards Clara began to change, to soften around the edges, transforming into a more complex, sorrowful understanding of her profound moral failure. Meanwhile, reports from the front line of Clara and Mark's new life continued to filter through Sadie. Their move to Mark's mother's basement was proving to be as disastrous as I had imagined. Mark's mother, a woman named Doris, was, according to Sadie's knitting circle gossip, a formidable and fussy woman. She had not welcomed her son and daughter-in-law with open arms, but with a long list of house rules. Beatrice's cousin is Doris's next-door neighbor, Sadie explained one afternoon, her voice a low, excited whisper. She says the arguments are constant. Doris complains that Clara doesn't know how to load a dishwasher properly. Clara complains that Doris's house smells like potpourri and regret, and the boy, Mark, is caught in the middle. Apparently, he just hides in the basement and plays video games. It was a pathetic image, but one that fit. Mark, faced with a problem he couldn't bully or intimidate, had retreated into infantilism. Clara, stripped of her status and her perfectly curated home, was left to wage a domestic war with a woman who held all the power. My curiosity about Mark, however, was growing. David's letter had mentioned the greed in his eyes. I had always disliked him, his smugness, his condescending tone when he explained financial matters to me as if I were a child. But had he been more than just an unpleasant son-in-law? Had he been the architect of Clara's cruelty? I called Arthur. "Arthur," I began after our usual pleasantries, "I need a favor. It's of a more personal nature." "Anything for you, Alina." "I want to know more about my son-in-law, Mark Stanton. Not just his current situation, but his financial history. I know it's an invasion of his privacy, but I have a vested interest. My daughter's welfare is still my concern, and I need to understand who she married. Can you recommend a discreet private investigator?" Arthur didn't miss a beat. "I can do better than that. The trust has a corporate security firm on retainer for due diligence. They are the best, and their discretion is absolute. What, specifically, are you looking for?" "Everything," I said. "His employment history, his credit reports, any significant debts or assets I might not know about. I want to know if he was in financial trouble before I sold my house." "I'll make the call," Arthur said. "They should have a preliminary report for me within a week." While the investigation was underway, I had an encounter that shook me more than I could have anticipated. I had decided to attend a matinee performance at the Symphony, a small luxury I had come to cherish. As I was leaving the grand concert hall, part of a slow-moving crowd, I saw her. It was Clara. She was standing across the street, waiting for a bus. It took me a moment to be sure it was her. This version of my daughter was almost unrecognizable. She was wearing a drab, ill-fitting black uniform, the kind worn by catering staff or ushers. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. Her face was pale and tired, devoid of makeup. She was holding a pair of sensible, worn-looking shoes in one hand while rubbing her stockinged feet. She looked up and down the street, her expression not angry or impatient, but utterly bone-deep weary. My first instinct was to hide, to shrink back into the crowd. But I was frozen, my feet rooted to the pavement. I watched as the bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. I watched as she joined the queue of other tired-looking people, shuffling forward, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She swiped a bus pass and disappeared inside. I stood there long after the bus had pulled away, its diesel fumes stinging my eyes. The image of her was burned into my mind. The cheap uniform, the exhausted posture, the profound, unadorned misery on her face. This was not the vindictive, self-righteous woman who had written me that note. This was a woman who was being ground down by the relentless machinery of a life she was not prepared for. My carefully constructed walls of anger and righteousness began to tremble. Seeing her from a distance, in the context of her new reality, was profoundly different from hearing about it through second-hand gossip. The abstract concept of her humiliation was now a concrete, painful image. She was not just living in a basement. She was working a low-wage job that was physically demanding, a job that required her to serve the very people whose ranks she had so desperately wanted to join. The satisfaction I had felt was gone, replaced by a complex cocktail of emotions, a lingering, bitter anger at what she had done, a grim acknowledgement that this was the consequence she had earned, and a new, unwelcome guest, a deep, visceral maternal pain. It was one thing to want your child to learn a lesson. It was another thing entirely to watch them suffer. I walked home, my mind in a daze. The city, which had felt so full of promise just an hour before, now seemed gray and unforgiving. I went up to my beautiful penthouse, to my silent, perfect home, and I was overcome by a crushing sense of loneliness. I had my freedom. I had my wealth. I had my revenge. But my daughter was waiting for a bus in cheap shoes, and the knowledge of it felt like a shard of glass in my heart. The phone call from Arthur a few days later was a welcome distraction. "Eleanor," he said, his voice grave, "the report on Mark Stanton is in. It's illuminating. I think you should come down to the office." I went immediately. Arthur sat me down in his office and handed me a thick, bound folder. "What they found is disturbing," he said. "Mark Stanton is not just a man with bad luck. He's a man with a gambling problem." I opened the folder. Inside were financial statements, credit card reports, and surveillance summaries. It was all there in black and white. For at least 2 years before David's death, Mark had been losing money, a lot of money. There were regular, large cash withdrawals from ATMs near casinos. There were transfers to offshore online betting sites. He had maxed out multiple secret credit cards and had taken out a high-interest personal loan, all without Clara's knowledge. The report continued. The deal that had fallen through right before they received the rent increase notice had been his last, desperate attempt to win big and cover his tracks. It hadn't been a legitimate business deal at all. It was a high-stakes poker game. He had lost everything. But the most damning piece of information was in the final section. The investigator had uncovered a series of emails between Mark and a loan shark. In the weeks after I had moved in with them, Mark was already deeply in debt. He had been pressuring Clara to ask me for the money from the house sale, not for renovations, but to pay off his gambling losses. The final email, dated just a week before Clara kicked me out, was from Mark to the loan shark. "Don't worry," it read. "I'm handling the mother-in-law problem. The old lady is sitting on a pile of cash from her house. I'll convince my wife to get her out of the house and get the money. Just give me 1 more month. I put the report down on Arthur's polished desk, my hands shaking with a fury that was cold and pure. It was him. It had always been him. Clara's cruelty, her coldness, her greed, it had all been fueled and manipulated by her husband's desperate, secret addiction. She had been a willing participant, yes. Her own character flaws, her vanity and selfishness, had made her susceptible. But Mark had been the puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows, all to feed his own demons. This changed everything. My battle had been with Clara, a painful, intimate war between a mother and a daughter, but I now realized I had been fighting the wrong enemy. Clara was a pawn, a deeply flawed and complicit pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. The king, the true source of the rot in their lives, was Mark, and he was still hiding in his mother's basement, letting Clara take the brunt of the consequences. "Arthur," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I need to know what legal options this gives us. The money I gave them for renovations. He used it to pay gambling debts. That's fraud, isn't it?" "It is," Arthur confirmed. "It would be difficult to prove in court without Clara's testimony. But yes, it is textbook fraud by deception." "And the loan shark?" "We have his name and location. We can forward this information to the authorities anonymously, of course. Men like that tend to attract a lot of police attention." A new plan began to form in my mind, colder and more precise than the first. My first plan had been about teaching my daughter a lesson. This new plan was about saving her. To do that, I first had to surgically remove the cancer that was her husband. "Do it," I said to Arthur. "Send the information about the loan shark to the police. And I want you to have your legal team draft a letter to Mark Stanton. A very specific letter. I want to offer him a deal." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "A deal?" "Yes," I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "A way out. For a price, of course. The price will be a full confession to his wife and his complete and permanent disappearance from her life." I left Arthur's office with a renewed sense of purpose. The sadness and confusion that had plagued me since seeing Clara at the bus stop was gone, replaced by a laser-like focus. The game had a new player, a new objective. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rescue. The legal team at Arthur's disposal was brutally efficient. The letter they drafted for Mark was not a suggestion. It was a cage constructed of words. I reviewed it in Arthur's office, a grim satisfaction settling over me as I read each carefully chosen phrase. It was a masterpiece of intimidation, cloaked in the calm, unassailable language of the law. The letter began by identifying the sender as a private counsel representing the financial interests of the Vance Trust, the entity from which I had given Clara the renovation money. It then laid out, in excruciating, bullet-pointed detail, everything the investigators had uncovered. It listed the secret credit card numbers, the dates and amounts of cash withdrawals from casino ATMs, the names of the online betting sites, and the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. It referenced the personal loan he had taken out, and most chillingly, it named the loan shark and the outstanding amount owed. It concluded the evidence portion with a transcript of the final email he had sent, the one where he promised to handle the mother-in-law problem. Every secret, every desperate lie was laid bare on that single sheet of paper. It was a document designed to induce sheer, ice-cold terror to show him that he was not just caught, but completely and utterly exposed. The second page outlined the deal. It was presented as a one-time, irrevocable offer to resolve the matter of his fraudulent misappropriation of funds from the Vance Trust. If he declined the offer, the letter stated, two things would happen simultaneously. First, a complete file of the evidence, including the fraud complaint, would be handed over to the district attorney's office. Second, a duplicate file would be delivered directly to his wife, Mrs. Clara Stanton. If he accepted the offer, however, the trust was prepared to be generous. In exchange for his full cooperation, he would be given a certified check for $50,000. A one-way, first-class plane ticket to any city in the world would be booked in his name. The trust's legal team would file all the necessary divorce paperwork on his behalf, citing irreconcilable differences, with a clause stating he would make no claim on any marital assets. The offer was conditional on 3 non-negotiable actions. 1. He would sign the divorce papers immediately. A courier would be dispatched to his location upon his acceptance of the offer. 2. He would write a full and detailed confession to his wife, explaining the gambling addiction, the full extent of the debt, his fraudulent use of her mother's money, and his manipulation of her. 3. He would vacate the premises of his current residence within 12 hours of receiving the funds and never attempt to contact Clara or any member of the Vance family again, in any form, for the rest of his life. "It's a checkmate, Alina," Arthur said, watching my face as I finished reading. "He's a cornered rat. You've offered him a hole to escape through. He will take it." "I know," I said, folding the letter and placing it back in its envelope. "Have it sent tomorrow morning. By courier, it must be handed directly to him." The next day, I didn't go to the shelter. I could. I stayed in my apartment, pacing the vast expanse of my living room, my mind a tempest of anticipation and dread. I was orchestrating a demolition. I was lighting a fuse that would blow my daughter's life apart in the desperate hope that she could build something better from the rubble. Was it the right thing to do? Was it cruel? I thought of Brenda at the shelter, of her son who just stood there and said nothing. I would not just stand here. I would act. The courier confirmed delivery at 10:15 a.m. The signature was Mark's, a shaky, barely legible scrawl. Now all I could do was wait. The scene in that cramped, potpourri-scented basement must have been one of pure animal panic. Mark, faced with the irrefutable evidence of his ruin, would have read the letter not once, but a dozen times, each reading deepening the sweat on his brow. The loan shark was a physical threat, a promise of broken bones. The district attorney was a promise of public humiliation and a jail cell. And the threat of Clara knowing the truth for a man like Mark, that was perhaps the most terrifying prospect of all, for it meant the end of his comfortable deception. The offer wasn't a deal, it was a lifeline. It was his only way out. According to the timeline Arthur's team later pieced together from phone records, Mark called the number on the letter at 11:30 a.m. He spoke to the lawyer, his voice a panicked whisper. He accepted the terms. The machine of my will began to move. A courier with the divorce papers was dispatched. A wire transfer was initiated. A flight to Vancouver was booked for the following morning. The hardest part, the confession, was left for him to handle. I imagine he spent the afternoon in a state of paralysis, trying to formulate the words that would detonate his marriage. He was a coward. He wouldn't have the courage to do it face to face, to watch the light of understanding dawn in Clara's eyes and see it curdle into disgust. He would write a letter. It was the coward's way out, and Mark was nothing if not a coward. Clara came home from her catering job just after 6 o'clock that evening, her body aching, her mind numb with the exhaustion of another day spent on her feet. She would have come down the basement stairs, expecting to see Mark on the couch, illuminated by the flickering light of a video game, perhaps to be met with a grunt of acknowledgement. Instead, she found the room empty. His laptop was gone. The few boxes of his personal belongings were gone. On the small, rickety coffee table was a plain white envelope with her name on it, and beside it, a set of car keys she didn't recognize and a small, handwritten note. The small note was from his mother, Doris. "Mark has gone," it would have read in a spidery script. "He said he was leaving you. He left this letter. I've put his things in the garage. You will need to be out of my house by the end of the week. This is a family matter, and you are no longer family." The cruelty of it, the swift, brutal dismissal from her mother-in-law, would have been the first blow. Then, her hands shaking, she would have opened the letter from Mark. It would not have been eloquent. It would have been the desperate, self-serving confession of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "Clara," it would begin, "I'm so sorry. I'm in a lot of trouble and I have to leave. There's something you need to know. I have a gambling problem. For years. The debts are bad, really bad. The money your mom gave us for the renovations, I used it to pay off some guys I owed. I was going to win it all back, I swear I was. I just needed one more big score. The rent increase at the apartment, it was the final straw. I was already drowning. I pushed you to get rid of your mom because I was desperate. I thought if we had the house to ourselves, we could use her money to get clear. I was wrong. I messed everything up. I have to go away, it's the only way. The divorce papers are already filed. You'll be better off without me. I'm sorry for everything. Mark. Reading those words, Clara's world would not have just cracked, it would have atomized. Every single pillar of her reality would have crumbled to dust in that instant. Her husband didn't love her. He had used her. Their financial problems weren't because of a bad economy or a tough job market. They were because of his secret addiction. The decision to throw me out, the act of ultimate betrayal against her own mother, hadn't even been her own idea. It had been a calculated move in a gambler's desperate scheme. She had sacrificed her mother, her morality, her family, for a lie. The heartless monster who owned the building hadn't ruined her life. Her husband had, and she had helped him. The grief, the rage, the shame, it must have been a tidal wave, a force so powerful it would have left her gasping for air on the floor of that miserable basement. She was utterly alone. Her husband was gone. Her mother-in-law was kicking her out. And her own mother, the mother she had cast aside, what could she possibly say to her now? How could she ever face me, knowing that I had been right all along and that she had been a fool? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the city lights, my phone on the table beside me silent. I had given her the truth, a brutal, undiluted dose of it. But the truth is a medicine that can either cure or kill. I didn't know what Clara would do. Would she collapse? Would she call a friend? Or would she, in the depths of her despair, finally call her mother? The call didn't come that night. It didn't come the next day. A full 48 hours passed in agonizing silence. I went to the shelter, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the work, but my mind was elsewhere. I was listening to Brenda talk about her son, and all I could see was Clara's face, alone in that basement. On the third day, my phone finally rang. It was an unknown number. My heart leaped into my throat. I answered, my voice a tense whisper. Hello. Is this Alina Vance? The voice was female, professional, and unfamiliar. Yes, this is she. Mrs. Vance, my name is Maria. I'm the director at the Haven Women's Shelter. My blood ran cold. Maria? Why was she calling me on my personal number? Maria, is everything all right? I'm not sure, Alina, she said, her voice laced with concern. There's a woman here. She came in late last night. She had nowhere else to go. She's in a very bad state. She hasn't said much, but she gave us your name as an emergency contact. Her name is Clara Stanton. She says she's your daughter. The world tilted on its axis. Clara, at the shelter, she hadn't called me, she hadn't reached out for help. She had walked, with what little she had left, to the one place she knew she could be anonymous, a place for homeless, abandoned women. She had come to my shelter. Unknowingly, she had sought refuge in the very institution her mother was funding, a place I had built from the ashes of her betrayal. The irony was so profound, so devastating, it took my breath away. Alina, are you still there? Maria's voice was gentle. Yes, I croaked, my throat tight. Yes, I'm here, I'm on my way. I grabbed my purse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my keys. I ran out of my apartment, my perfect penthouse, my fortress of solitude, and into the real, messy, painful world. The game was over. The strategies, the letters, the revenge, it all seemed like a foolish, childish charade in the face of this. My daughter was at a homeless shelter, and I was the only person in the world who could tell her she wasn't home. What would you do if you were in my shoes? This is a moment where a mother's heart is tested beyond limits. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement with Mama Lottie stories helps us grow and bring more tales of life's intricate turns. If you're finding value in our story, a super thanks is a wonderful way to show support. Now, let's see what happens next. Remember to check out the other stories on the channel after this one concludes. The taxi ride to the shelter was the longest of my life. My mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions. Guilt, sharp and piercing. I had done this. My calculated plan to remove Mark had resulted in my daughter seeking refuge among the city's most vulnerable. Fear. What state would she be in? The professional calm in Maria's voice could not hide the underlying concern, and a strange, terrible tenderness. My daughter was broken, and in her brokenness, she had stumbled into my orbit, not as a defiant adversary, but as a person in desperate need. I arrived at the shelter, and Maria met me at the door, her face a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. She now knew that her quiet volunteer, Elena, was the mother of the distraught woman who had arrived the night before. "She's in the quiet room," Maria said in a low voice, leading me down a clean linoleum hallway that smelled of bleach and cafeteria soup. "She hasn't eaten. She hasn't really slept. She just sits there. Elena, she's in shock." "Did she say what happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Only that her husband left her and she was thrown out of her home. She seems deeply ashamed. It took my staff hours to get even that much out of her." Maria stopped in front of a closed door. "She doesn't know I've called you. I'll leave you two alone." She gave my arm a compassionate squeeze and walked away. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed open the door. The room was small, with a couple of worn armchairs and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Clara was sitting in one of the chairs, facing the window, her back to me. She was still wearing the same clothes I had seen her in at the bus stop, the drab catering uniform. Her hair was unkempt and her shoulders were slumped in a way that spoke of utter defeat. She was so still, she could have been a statue, a monument to despair. I closed the door softly behind me. The click of the latch made her flinch. She turned her head slowly and her eyes met mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her face was a wreck. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen from crying, her skin was pale and blotchy. But it was the expression in her eyes that shattered my heart. The pride was gone. The arrogance, the defiance, the condescension, it had all been burned away. What was left was a raw, gaping wound of shame and bewilderment. She looked at me as if I were an apparition, her mind struggling to reconcile my presence in this place. "Mom," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. What are you doing here?" I walked slowly towards her and knelt on the floor in front of her chair so that our eyes were level. I didn't know what to say. "I told you so" was a cruel and useless sentiment. "Everything will be all right" was a lie, so I said the only thing that felt true. "Maria called me," I said softly. "You listed me as your emergency contact." Her face crumpled. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, God," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know who else to put." I didn't have anyone else. The words, "I didn't have anyone else," broke through the last of my defenses. I reached out and pulled her hands away from her face, holding them in mine. Her hands were cold, her perfectly manicured nails now chipped and broken. "It's all right, Clara," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "It's all right." "No," she choked out, shaking her head. "No, it's not. Nothing is all right. You don't understand. Mark, he's gone. He left me. It was all a lie, Mom. Everything was a lie." "I know," I said. Her head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes searching mine. You know, how could you know?" This was the moment, the final card to be played. The truth that lay between us, the truth that had the power to either heal us or destroy us completely. I had to tell her. She deserved to know the full story. Not the version Mark had written, but the one I had orchestrated. "Clara," I began, choosing my words with infinite care. "The new owner of your building, the heartless monster who tripled your rent, it was me." The silence that followed my confession was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air, all the sound, all the nascent warmth out of the small room. Clara stared at me, her red-rimmed eyes wide with a confusion so profound it looked like a physical pain. Her mind, already shattered by Mark's betrayal, was trying to process an idea that was simply impossible. "What?" She breathed, the word a tiny, lost sound. "What did you say?" "The building," I repeated, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. "David, your father, he was a very wise investor. He bought that building years ago. When he passed, it became part of the trust he left for me. I am the owner, Clara. I was the one who hired the new management company. I was the one who approved the rent increase for your apartment." She recoiled as if I had struck her. She physically pulled her hands from mine, scrambling backward in her chair, trying to put distance between us. The initial shock was giving way to a dawning, horrified comprehension. The puzzle pieces of her recent catastrophe, the sudden sale, the anonymous new owner, the brutally specific rent increase, my own feigned poverty, were clicking into place in her mind, forming a picture of a betrayal so monstrous, so intimate that it dwarfed everything Mark had done. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes darting around the drab room as if seeking an escape from my words. "No, that's not possible. You were living in that little hotel. You had no money. You told me the money was gone." "I lied," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "There was more money than you could ever imagine. David kept it a secret to protect us, to protect you from men like Mark." "Men like Mark?" She shrieked, her voice suddenly raw and powerful, fueled by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. She surged to her feet, her exhaustion forgotten, and stood over me, trembling from head to toe. "Men like Mark, you did this to me. You, my own mother. You watched me lose everything. You listened to me cry on the phone, begging you for help, and you lied to my face while you were the one holding the knife. You let me end up here, in a homeless shelter. Did you enjoy it? Was it a fun little game for you?" Her accusations rained down on me, each one a perfectly aimed blow. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to defend myself. I let her purge the poison. I had known this was coming. I owed her this. I remained kneeling on the floor, looking up at her, my own tears now flowing freely. "It was not a game, Clara," I said when she finally paused, gasping for breath. "It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life." "The hardest thing?" She laughed, a hysterical, broken sound that held no humor. "The hardest thing? Try getting fired from your job because you can't stop crying at work. Try having to sell your wedding ring for gas money. Try facing the fact that your husband never loved you and that your own mother hates you so much she would orchestrate your complete and utter ruin." "I don't hate you, Clara," I said, my voice breaking. "I have never for 1 second stopped loving you." "Love," she spat the word. "You call this love, this is torture. This is a sick, twisted revenge because I hurt your feelings. An extra mouth to feed. That's what this is about, isn't it? You wanted to show me what it felt like to have nothing. Well, congratulations, Mom. Lesson learned. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?" I rose slowly to my feet, my old knees aching in protest. I stood before her, not as an accuser, but as a witness to the devastation I had wrought. "No, I am not happy. I have been in agony every single day. But this isn't just about what you said to me. This is about what you were becoming. And it was about the man who was twisting you into that person." "Don't you dare talk about Mark," she warned, her finger jabbing the air between us. "You don't get to talk about him." "I have to," I said firmly. "Because you still don't know the whole truth. Mark's letter, it didn't tell you everything. He didn't just have a gambling problem, Clara. He was a predator. And you were his prey." She stared at me, her anger momentarily eclipsed by confusion. "After you left," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "I hired someone to look into him. I had to understand why. Why my daughter, the girl I raised to be smart and strong, could have become so callous. I found out about the secret credit cards, the online betting accounts, the loan shark he owed thousands of dollars to. I found out that for months, while Dad was dying, Mark was pressuring you, manipulating you, planning to get his hands on the money from our house." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the email, the one I had kept as my own bitter fuel. "He wrote this, Clara, a week before you kicked me out." I held it out to her. She didn't take it, so I read it aloud. "Don't worry, I'm handling the mother-in-law problem. The old lady is sitting on a pile of cash from her house. I'll convince my wife to get her out of the house and get the money." I let the words hang in the air. I saw the impact they had on her, a fresh wave of nausea and understanding washing over her face. She saw it now. Her decision had not been a moment of spontaneous cruelty. It had been the final move in a long con, and she had been the unwitting accomplice. "The rent increase wasn't the beginning of my plan, Clara," I said, my voice softening. "It was the end. It was the only way I could see to get him out of your life before he destroyed you completely. I had to blow up the building to save you from the fire that was raging inside. The letter he wrote you, the divorce papers, his plane ticket out of the country, I paid for all of it. I gave him a choice: disappear forever, or I would give all of this evidence to the police and to you. Clara staggered backward and sank into the chair, her legs giving out from under her. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. She stared at the brick wall outside the window, but I knew she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing her entire marriage, her entire life for the past several years, replaying in her mind, but this time with the truth as the soundtrack. The little cruelties, the subtle manipulations, the constant pressure for more money, it all made a horrible, sickening kind of sense now. "So you knew," she whispered, her voice a ghost of what it had been. "All this time, you knew he was a liar, and I defended him. I chose him over you." "You were manipulated," I said gently. "He preyed on your insecurities, on your desire for a certain kind of life." "No," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength, but this time it was directed inward, a tool of brutal self-assessment. "No, don't make excuses for me. He preyed on my greed, my vanity, my selfishness. He saw a flaw in me, Mom, a deep, ugly flaw, and he used it. You tried to warn me, didn't you? All those little comments you made about him, about his spending. I thought you were being critical, jealous, but you saw it. You saw the rot. And I was too blind and stupid to listen." She finally looked away from the window and back at me. The anger was gone. The hysteria was gone. In their place was a clarity that was more painful than either. It was the clarity of someone who has finally seen themselves for who they are, with no filters, no excuses. "You went through all this," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, terrible awe. "You built this whole scheme. You became a monster, to save me from a bigger monster." "I did what I had to do," I said, my throat aching. A mother does what she has to do to protect her child, even when that child doesn't want to be protected. For a long time, we were silent. The sounds of the shelter, a distant phone ringing, the low murmur of voices in the hall filtered into the room. It was a place of broken lives and last chances. We were just one more story in a building full of them. Finally, Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked down at her ruined hands, then at her cheap uniform. She looked around the small, anonymous room. This was her rock bottom, a place she had arrived at through a series of choices, both her own and others. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small like a child's. It was the question I had been waiting for, the question that would determine the future. I had broken her. I had enlightened her. Now I had to offer her a path forward. I reached out and took her hand again. This time she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled weakly around mine. "Now," I said, my voice full of a strength I didn't know I possessed, "you get up, you wash your face, and you come home." "Home?" she asked, her eyes filling with a fresh wave of tears, but these were different. They were not tears of anger or self-pity, but of a fragile, nascent hope. "I don't have a home." "Yes, you do," I said, squeezing her hand. "You have always had a home, you just forgot where it was. Come home with me, Clara, to the penthouse. It's big enough. There's room." She looked at me, at our joined hands, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a genuine, unforced emotion flickered in her eyes. It was gratitude. It was the profound, humbling gratitude of a person who has been lost in a storm and has just seen the light of a lighthouse on the shore. She nodded, unable to speak. She just nodded. We walked out of the quiet room together, my arm around her shaking shoulders. Maria was in the hallway, and she gave me a small, knowing smile. She didn't ask any questions. She had seen enough stories to know what a rescue looked like. As we walked toward the exit, we passed the donation room where I had worked, where I had listened to Brenda's story. Clara glanced in, seeing the piles of used clothing, the tangible evidence of lives upended. She saw her own reflection for a moment, not as a resident of a shelter, but as a woman who had, by a combination of her mother's ruthless love and her father's secret foresight, been given a second chance that so many others would never get. The sun was bright as we stepped out of the shelter. It made us both squint. I hailed a taxi, and as we settled into the back seat, Clara leaned her head against my shoulder, her body racked with a final, cleansing sob. I held her, stroking her hair, just as I had done when she was a little girl who had woken from a nightmare. The nightmare was over, but the long, slow process of waking up had just begun. We were not healed, we were not whole, but we were together. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough.